Great, fantastic. And thank you, everybody, for choosing this session, right? This is the fun session, right? And we talk about the good stuff, and you may even get a little bit of a hint of good investment advice. Now, the topic is huge and enormous. It's so funny, when I was growing up, $1 million was a lot of money. Then, you know, in the 90s, at some point, sort of $1 billion became a lot of money. And now, unless it's $1 trillion, it doesn't really matter, right? I mean, think about it. During the past 18 months, the United States government alone put $18 trillion into the economy with the various support systems. I mean, it's incredible. The global economy, by the way, just for reference, is about 100 trillion, right? So we've got these enormous imbalances. And as you all know, the central banks' balance sheets are at levels we've never seen before, unless it was war. You see the government deficits. It used to be Japan was the standout with debt to GDP of more than 200%. Well, now, even my home country, Germany, has opened up some of the fiscal spigots there. So, you know, enormous macroeconomic imbalances. And, you know, where does that lead us? What are the opportunities? What should we be scared about? And it's interesting. With this big topic that we have, I don't want to get lost in sort of arguing about macroeconomic impacts. I want to try and keep it at the ground level. What does it actually mean for you and me? And we've got a fantastic opportunity because Japan's new Prime Minister, Mr. Kishida, wants to reinvent a new form of capitalism. So excellent. So I think let's keep it at the ground level. And we've got experts, right? We've got practitioners. We've got Aya Murakami from the famous, you know, investment fund that puts a lot of pressure on the old Japanese companies to change. We've got Narita Sensei, who is a superb macroeconomist, but also a big investor, right, in decentralized finance and other forms of disruptive innovation. And then, of course, we've got Leo Lewis, who makes a living by trying to make sense out of all of this, right, for the Financial Times. Now, that's the net that we're operating with. So let's see whether we can focus. And I want to ask one question. Leo, if you had 2 minutes with the Japanese Prime Minister who wants to redefine capitalism and all that good stuff, right? What, if in those 2 minutes, what is the advice that you give him? What is it that you want him to focus on?
Well, thank you, Jesper. So, I mean, first of all, we were fortunate enough to speak to the Prime Minister just a few days after he officially took over, and I'll come to that in a moment. But at the moment, if you go to the Tokyo Kaikan just next to the Imperial Palace, there is an exhibition that they were putting up yesterday, I saw, about Shibusawa, the father of Japanese capitalism, as everyone likes to call it. Now, there's an interesting thing going on at the moment, which is that there seems to be a deliberate confusion between the idea that Japanese capitalism is somehow already a kinder version of capitalism, that it's much more aligned to the way that capitalism appears to be going if you look at the rhetoric out of the US and elsewhere. I think that's very dangerous because when I first came to Japan, we were told that the Japanese view of capitalism was that business is war. That was real capitalism. And that business is war was ascribed to the Japanese, and the Japanese seemed at the time to enjoy having that saying ascribed to them. And so what my piece of advice would be, get your timing of Japanese capitalism right, okay? Work out which period of Japanese capitalism you're interested in, and then focus on that. So that would be what I would say if I had 2 minutes with him. I did fortunately have about 30 minutes with him. But we were kind of asking the questions, and the most interesting part for me was when we asked him about something he'd written in a book that was published about just over a year ago. So before he was Prime Minister, well before he was Prime Minister, and he suggested that the Japanese governance code, which I personally regard as one of the great successes of the last of the last sort of 6 years in Japan. It's given big opportunities to people like Murakami-san and others. He wants that to be a two-tier system where you're splitting out governance demands on big companies versus small and medium companies. I think I know why he wants to do it. He wants to be seen as a friend to the SME sector, and that's a laudable thing to be. But I totally disagree with the idea that you should split the demands of governance according to the size of the company, because I think governance is a kind of absolute thing.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you, Leo, for this insight. Maybe we come back to some of the impressions that you had during the interview there. So the gap between the big guys and the small guys, I mean, how can it be in America 5 companies are worth more than the entire Tokyo Stock Exchange? How can that be, right? Aya, your 2 minutes with Mr. Kishida. What is your words of advice? Or since you're very good at advising companies, you actually don't just give advice, you actually put pressure on people, which is how we like it. That's why Womenomics actually works. What would your 2 minutes of advice be to the Prime Minister?
So when he came up, there was, discussion, distribution or growth, but it's very hard to distribute when, the Japan is not really successful in the domestic demand. People look at, saying that, okay, retained earnings in Japanese company has, increased, the market has increased, and all the people feel, oh, why is it not coming to me? But the problem is all those companies have gained its returns through the external demands. So, it's very hard to say how to distribute. I think we really have to look at how to grow the Japanese companies. And then when you look at the, Japanese companies, the problem is actually SMEs, the return on equity. When you look at all the 2,500 Japanese companies listed in Tokyo Exchange, the companies that has low return on equity, that has a lot of cash, those are the companies, SMEs, the companies that market cap is below 300 million or the 500 million. So when Prime Minister Kishida has went to the House of the Representative election, Sanae-san was talking about how to tax the corporate cash and deposits, and people were really skeptical about that. But I actually really support that, and I would say please listen to Sanae-san what she's saying, because what she said is that she has to tax to the cash or the cross shareholdings that all the listed companies have. But yeah, it's true, almost 10% of the Japanese companies has its cash and cross shareholdings more than its market cap. They're just sleeping in the bank accounts, and we really need to push these to to go outside to do the investments. So that's what I would say to Prime Minister Kishida.
Excellent. And, this is absolutely key. We talk about the imbalances, and we want to talk about the central bank. We want to talk about the government deficit, because these are easy things that are far away. But actually, for us as practitioners in the Japanese economy, the single biggest imbalance is the fact that the corporate sector has been hoarding cash and hoarding cash. You can actually show the cash hoardings have gone from about 40% of GDP to over 100% of GDP. And even over the last 2 years, during the pandemic, the cash balances of listed companies, and these are the guys who are supposed to be the greedy ones, who are supposed to maximize returns, the cash balances have gone up by about 2.5% of GDP. Incredible. What are you doing? You're not paying your shareholders and you're not paying your workers. So that's a big imbalance. And I think no matter what form of new capitalism you are going to reinvent, let's start by figuring out where the big imbalances are and where the big imbalances are that you, as the government, can actually influence. Now, Narita Sensei, what is your words of wisdom?
Sorry, can I ask a quick question before moving on to my part?
Of course.
That is, you are sort of totally correct that during the Abenomics period, the profit margin of Japanese firms improved a bit, but the improved profits sort of didn't go to workers and they didn't go to investment, and the firms just accumulated that cash. And what do you think is the reason for that? And why do Japanese firms like cash so much? Do you have
Why
any?
do the Japanese love cash? Aya, that's your business.
I think it's going to change, but the reason why is that who holds the company. So when you look at the company, it was held by corporates, it was held by banks, so those people don't really board what to do to the management. They would just say, take it easy, you don't have to do investments, especially the banks. Why do you push the companies to do the investment? You can't take the collateral, if they take the risk. So those were the people who are actually the shareholder of those companies. But it's, gradually changing. Banks, life insurance, these companies are, selling its shares. Corporates, it's not that much, but foreign shareholders and, private investors coming into Japanese companies. And right now, BOJ and GPIF holds 10% of its Tokyo exchange. So we are the one who is going to have the, the good part if the company's retained earnings go up. So, if the shareholders, dynamics will change, I think companies will change gradually. And I feel, by doing engagement investments, I feel that it's going to change. And sooner or later, wait 10 years, I think you will see the different world.
10 years, a different world. Leo, why do you hoard so much cash?
Well,
by the way, the English household sector is in massive deficit.
Yeah, well, no, I mean, of course, the reason I hoard cash is the same reason as so many Japanese companies hoard cash, which is that I care about all stakeholders, not just my shareholders, right? Which is, of course, the line that I have been told so many times by Japanese CEOs about their priorities. And at one level, it's very attractive as an answer to the question. And at another level, it's also true that Japanese companies have historically paid that kind of attention, but it's also true that it's being used as a disguise for activity that is frankly not friendly to shareholders at all. It's the opposite of friendly, and the problem that you get is when you have a situation like we did last year, where after years of saying we can't do telework, we're Japanese, we can't do telework, we haven't got the technology for it. Very, very quickly, it turns out that Japanese companies were able to do that quite effective. Many of them were able to do it very effectively. And all the staff who were saying, yeah, but I would really have suited me, but the female staff in particular, it would have really suited me if I'd been able to telework for all those years that I've been working at this company. I mean, and suddenly it turns out you can do it and everything does work okay. Well, there's a stakeholder that wasn't being served by your version of capitalism, right? Make up your mind. You either serve all the stakeholders and you do a good job of it, or you serve the shareholders only and you take your chances with that version of capitalism.
Narita Sensei, your 2 minutes with Prime Minister Kishida, what should he focus on?
So I know now sort of everybody likes chatting about the new form of capitalism. But my personal belief is that the new form of capitalism is probably not the most important thing. And I believe that it's much more important to think about the new form of democracy and new form of politics before talking about capitalism. And why is that? So if we think about capitalism, it's really sort of rapidly, constantly changing. That is, if we sort of compare our daily life now versus 25 years ago, they are completely different worlds, okay? And we use completely different services and we consume completely different goods. And this difference has been sort of created by capitalism. So in a sense, there's always sort of huge experimentation and rapid evolution and growth on the side of capitalism. But if we compare this situation with what's going on in politics and democracy, the situation is completely different. The way we operate elections is more or less the same now and 25 years ago. And it's really stunning. And then just a few days ago, we went to local schools to write down the names of politicians and parties on paper. And we are still talking about whether we introduce internet into election and politics or not. So it's almost something completely crazy going on. And if we look back sort of from the 22nd century on sort of our current life or our current political life, then so we think that sort of our brains are completely broken. So that's my sense. So in that sense, there is a much larger and much clearer room for innovations and improvement on the side of democracy and politics compared to capitalism. So we need much more sort of experimentation and much more innovation and much more changes in the way we do politics. And sort of in recent sort of years, there are a variety of movements in the private sector, led by the private sector, to sort of try to do a lot of experimentations on the way we do politics and we make collective decision making. One example is that sort of lots of people are trying to create new small countries on the sea, and lots of sort of billionaires are trying to fund such efforts. And Facebook and Microsoft and other companies are trying to sort of build their own countries and their own virtual nations on the metaverse and so on. So I think sort of this kind of efforts toward a new form of democracy is probably orders of magnitude sort of more important than endlessly talking about the new form of capitalism that typically doesn't have much meaning.
So this is very interesting, you know, because you take it outside of the economics problem. And I think personally that Narita-sensei's point is very valid. The economy is fine. I mean, there's imbalances here and there, right? But actually, whether it was Trump, whether it was Brexit, right? The real challenges that have changed our life and have caused so much insecurity is the public discourse, is the way democracy is being undermined, is being challenged by new technology. And maybe that's something, right, where politicians should be focusing on. It was very interesting. Leo, I think you were there for the first session with Audrey Tan, right? I mean, the digital minister from Taiwan, and, you know, talking about the trust, that everything starts with the trust by the government in the people, and have this bottom-up feedback loop, right, to actually bring about, you know, positive changes. Leo, from your perspective, you know, in terms of Narita-sensei's point, you know, any sort of comments or follow-ups that you would have?
Yeah, well, because Narita-sensei mentioning that the metaverse and the impact that might have and or could have, you know, I think Japan. Well, I think Japan already has some experience with the most negative implication of it all, which is that you become much more divorced from real life, as it were, and you know, there's certainly.
What you mean the hikikomori? And
right. So it's Japanization essentially of
Japanization is virtualization.
Right. But no, everything Narita-sensei said is dead right, which is that you know, you can generate this momentum quite quickly, I suspect, and that there's a kind of fear of that momentum. It seems that Japan has allowed to take hold of things. Maybe you know, because we were talking about cash earlier. You know, there are Japanese companies that will in the documents that they use to attract new graduates will say, this is how much cash we have. We could not take any more cash. We could not have any business for 5 years and we would survive. They literally put that in the recruitment thing. And so, you know, this idea of providing stability, that the company's role is to provide stability, and that the government's role is to provide stability. I think they get very muddled, Narita-sensei. Will you not? Well, actually, go back to Narita. Did you not agree that it's a kind of confusion there that you're seeing between the politics and the kind of corporate attitude?
Yes. So your point is that both the government and the corporations are confused about sort of what they should be looking for. That's probably correct. And sort of another way to elaborate on that is that sort of much of today's imbalance in the sort of global market is coming from the market capitalization of something that is not reflected into sort of current cash flows, right? That is, if we look at the market sort of caps of the biggest companies in the world, probably the revenue multiple for these companies is much, much higher than those for the biggest companies 30 years ago. So in that sense, sort of today's market sort of puts much more value on the future and expectation about what will happen in the future and future cash flows and so on, compared to what's happening right now. And in that sense, maybe the Japanese government, the attitude of Japanese corporations and the government you just described, maybe somewhat outdated compared to what's happening in today's global market.
Yeah, dozo.
Well, makes sense. In these 2 years, Tesla's shares went 24 times bigger, but it doesn't really generate its profit compared to the Toyota. In 2 years, the company's shares, it just went up to 1.3. So, but to be honest, I am value investor, and it's so hard for me to see these, Tesla, Facebook, these companies. Why is it valuation like that? It's to be honest, it's very difficult for me to judge or understand this valuation. But what I can say is that people are looking at companies' future. What are they going to? Are they going to generate new investment type or new earnings? And in Japanese companies, we can't see that. I mean, of course, the cash is sleeping in the banks. How do you see that? So, and I also feel that changing a bit of the topics, like when we talk about the US companies, how they are going to do the future investments or ESG, these kind of things. And Japanese management usually fit these words to their companies, but it's very different, You can't really compare US and Japan, what's going on. Like one of the time after the COVID-19, when I went to see the management, I asked what are you going to do with all these cash? Are you planning to do the investment? And then he would bring up the Nikkei newspaper. And the first page of the Nikkei newspaper, it said, too much engagement made the bankrupt of the many US companies. Of course, yeah, shareholders payout was, almost 100% in US companies. They've tried to increase the return on equity. And these management are trying to compare their companies when they have a cash more than its market cap, saying, this is what happens. This is what happens when you pay to the shareholders or when you invest too much. And then, also another word, ESG. ESG, I don't want the ESG to be the magical word for the Japanese management to, say that they're doing something. Because when we talk about the ESG, we are losing for the governance in Japan, and ESG is actually the new type of the investment. When you are making, good management, good governance in that company, next step is ESG. You can't really talk about that when you're doing bad management. So, imbalance and many type of the new words, ESG, or the, many type of like companies like Tesla came up. But of course, at the same time, we always have to differentiate Japan and the US, what's going on. And we really need to look at these valuations.
Excellent. I mean, the interesting thing is that obviously we could have had this debate 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, right? The numbers got a little bit bigger, but effectively the preference for cash, right? The preference for, dare I say, financial capitalist inefficiency, right? In a hard-nosed sense, is very, very strong in Japan. Leo, you've been covering Japan for how many years? 16. So you arrived when you were 8. This is good. So 16 years in Japan. What are the good aspects of Japan? I mean, in this world of imbalances and confusion, and a lot of technological change, I think it's actually quite remarkable that I think actually some of the forces of resilience where Japan is actually very strong. And I was very interested in the opening session you heard the former Minister Kono, right, saying that initially I was, as the minister, in favor of more dictatorial powers to the government, but I've changed my mind because I learned that it's not the dictatorial powers that I need the trust from the mayors to get things done. And that's something, where Japan has actually been, in my personal opinion, done a very good job. But Leo, in your perspective, what can the world learn from Japan?
Well, it's not just what it can learn from Japan, but one of the myths about Japan that somehow evolved, and it's weirdly tied in with this idea that Japan has already got a different form of capitalism. Somehow tied in with that is the idea that Japan lacks an entrepreneurial spirit, and we hear this in its modern context in, well, why isn't there more venture capital? Why isn't more venture capital aimed at small companies? Why don't we have 100 unicorns rather than 5, and so on and so on? But the reality is, of course, that Japan is very, very entrepreneurial indeed, and the scale of the SME sector is testament to that entrepreneurialism. That the problem has come, I suspect, in the fact that far too much of Japan is listed, and so it comes in the scrutiny of people like Aya-san, and don't get me wrong, Aya-san's scrutiny is exactly what you need, but there are a lot of companies that shouldn't be listed in Japan, but that doesn't take away from how entrepreneurial Japan is, and I've been constantly impressed actually by the historic ability of Japanese to take an idea and turn it into a business, which is what we're talking about. It just hasn't taken the same form in this most recent 15, 20 years of digitization.
So just to give you the numbers on that, the US stock market is 7 times larger than the Japanese stock market, right? American venture capital, right, funded about 12,000 companies over the last year, right? In Japan, it's venture capital has funded 2,000 companies, which is 6 times larger, which is kind of in the ballpark, right, of the market capitalization. Relative to that, right, you actually find that the number of listed companies in both Japan and the United States is about 4,000 companies. So that's where you've got all this excessive competition that's going on. And in my personal opinion, dear Mr. Kishida, Suga had the right idea. Bringing about industrial consolidation, streamlining, doing away with some of the weaker companies is actually the best way forward. Aya, from your perspective, right? What are the good aspects? I mean, you're fighting the good cause, so this is good. But where do you think, I'd rather live in Japan rather than Singapore?
Well, I think it's culture, it's the, I mean, when I go to, right now in Singapore, it's hard to go to Japan, right? And all the Japanese restaurants are booked almost a year until, year ahead. People love Japan, people want to go to Hokkaido, Niseko, and then Singaporean, they would love to go to Japan when the the quarantine will be opened up. If I ask which country do you want to go, they would always say, they want to go to Japan. So I think it has its culture and of the cities, the atmosphere and the beautifulness. It would definitely attract foreigners, but at the same time, doing business in Japan, I would have to say it's very difficult. Like you said that the number of the companies, 4,000 in US, 2,500 in Japan. The market cap is almost 7 to 8 times different. Too much competitiveness. When I go for the SMEs investments, they're suffering and then killing each other, even though the Japanese market's shrinking. So doing business in Japan, I don't know, it's very, very difficult to win its business, and then you still have to do the competition. So what I would say, if I'm in Japan and do the business, I would say, just do the merging companies, if you get the companies and merge all the companies and get one together, then, high return on equity easily,
Aya, this is what I love about you. You're always on message. This is fantastic, right? This is very good. Now, Narita Sensei, from your sort of perspective, right? 2 things really. I know that you're, a very active advisor, and to entrepreneurs, to startup companies. Where specifically here in Japan do you see, some opportunities?
Well, if I knew the solution, I wouldn't sort of tell you the answer, and I would instead invest.
Well, we're friends. We're all part. We're part of the.
industry.
Yeah,
So-
This is the globus keiretsu, right? We do lots of
Yeah.
stable shareholders.
Yeah, but I'm no expert, I'm no real sort of expert on sort of startup business or any type of business by any means. So it's hard for me to tell the answer. But so instead, can I sort of provide one personal perspective
Perfect.
on the where sort of Japan is? So from my perspective. So I'm more like a sort of academic who is going back and forth between Japan and the US. And sort of you once sort of asked me sort of what is the biggest opportunity in Japan. And I was sort of thinking a little bit about that. And I couldn't actually come up with any sort of big opportunity in Japan. But I just realized that maybe the biggest opportunity in Japan is the apparent lack of any big opportunity in any part of the society.
God, you're
It's
a Zen
little
monk.
sarcastic, but yes. Say one personal sort of version of that story is that for say academics or scientists or university researchers, now there's absolutely no reason for any competent talent to go back to Japan, because the environment is so bad from sort of every possible perspective. But it also means that then sort of there's so little inflow of talents and resources and ideas into the Japanese market, so that it's relatively free from sort of too much competition, like what's happening in the US market or in the Chinese market. So in that sense, in Japan, sort of personally, I feel like sort of we can do whatever we want without thinking too much about the severity of competition. So that's my sort of somewhat sarcastic view about the opportunities in Japan. And I know this is not the real answer to your question, but this is one.
But it is interesting, which gets us to the final point I want to get at, which is, I mean, we talk about imbalances, and of course, as macroeconomists, you talk about, the central bank, you talk about the fiscal deficit. As investors, you talk about the naiburuho, you talk about, excessive competition. Ultimately, demographics. Demographics is a huge, huge issue. For example, I personally am very optimistic on industrial reorganization, excessive competition actually being weeded out simply by looking at the data. Japan has 3.6 million hoarding, right? 3.6 million corporations. Of these 2.6 million, the president and CEO is over 70 years old. Of this, more than 70% have no successor lined up because musuko musume are doing something else, right? And don't want to take over the business. So what will happen? Now I am the CEO of a mid-sized corporation, right? I have no successor lined up. I realize, oh my God, my buddy is buketteru, right? Because if you get over 70, 1 in 3 of us are going to get some form of, Alzheimer-like disease. So mergers, streamlining at the small and medium-sized company levels is going to be an avalanche, right, over the next 10 years going forward. And I think, accelerating that sort of trend is like a surfer, right, dear Mr. Kishida. You don't want to go against the wave. You want to go with the wave. And the demography here, right, certainly in terms of the opportunities for industrial reorganization are very large. Leo, when you think about the demography of Japan, what springs to your mind? Where are the opportunities? Where are the challenges?
Well, on the issue of age-related illnesses and so on, a few years ago now, was it 4 years ago? Actually, another quite sensible idea of the Abe era was the creation of AMED, because as it turns out, the way that health in Japan is funded, I didn't realize fully until this, is that it's split between different ministries. So you've got the education ministry, the health ministry, and there are other areas which can contribute. The idea of using data to collect and collate instances of particular types of age-related ill health from different parts of Japan was actually very exciting, because if you think of what's happened over the last 2 years with the pandemic, I mean, what's been so impressive was the speed with which a vaccine was produced. It's immensely impressive, and one of the reasons it was as quick as it was is not because there have been huge advances in the way you approach this, but also because there were so many instances of the illness that you could act collectively and decisively to work out what the problem was, and then to attack it. Now, the idea that you've got the world's oldest society sitting here in various states of declining health, but that you could use that 128 million person database to become a center of treatment and the approach to age-related ill health. I mean, that's the big opportunity for Japan. I mean, if that's what I were doing, it would be in the data collection around age-related ill health. I mean, that's not a particularly sexy thing. It's the opposite of sexy. But it's where the opportunity is in Japan, given its demographic profile.
Yeah, I think you're familiar. If you look at MRIs, right? If you look at MRI data, you find that Japan has, it's not the exact number, about 10 times more data on MRIs than the United States of America per capita, because in America, nobody can afford an MRI, while in Japan, you can afford it. But unfortunately, that wealth of super big data, right, is disconnected, right? And nobody can actually use it, right? So again, Mr. Kishida, if you want to talk about imbalances and turn them into an opportunity, forget that new capitalism stuff, try new healthcare. Aya, from your perspective, you know, you're a young professional woman. She just gave birth to a third child. You know, when you think about the Japanese demographics, what springs to mind?
You know, what Leo pointed out, it's really totally correct. It makes sense. And, you know, the market, it's those data going to be very useful in the market, like in China or those, you know, countries. And you know, at the same time, I'm actually very, you know, optimistic about the Japanese government doing that, because when we came to this vaccination, people were very worried that it would be very slow in Japan, right? But then, you know, at the point, actually, it went very fast. And then by like October, most of the people were, you know, getting the vaccination. So when they actually tried to work it out, you know, they are very successful. And maybe that's also one of the efforts by Mr. Kono. But it's very, you know, when they are all together trying to work out the process, they can be very successful. And we still have these, you know, assets in Japan. So I think whether or not the Prime Minister Kishida, if he can find the right direction, I think there will be a good future in Japan as well, you know?
No, it is actually incredible. I mean, 一緒に渡れば怖くはない, right? I mean, you know, once it gets going, right? And it's not the government, it's basically civic society. Narita Sensei, demographics, any thoughts?
Yes, so it sounds very sort of dismal and dark future going forward in front of Japan.
Your previous comment was pretty dismal and dark.
Yes, but then let me provide a little more sort of optimistic view. So if we look at data for the past few decades, then there's some interesting fact about the relationship between demography and economic growth. That is, if we think about sort of how much aging is going on in different countries versus how much per capita GDP growth different countries experience. If we look at the relationship between these two things, population aging versus economic growth, then it turns out that there's no clear correlation between the two. That is, countries with more rapidly aging populations do not necessarily grow slower. Then this suggests that it may be possible to sort of deal with population aging if we can do something. And looks like sort of the key behind this lack of correlation between population aging and economic growth is the degree of automation and the introduction of machines in the process of the service sector as well as the manufacturing sector. That is, if the population is experiencing sort of rapid aging, then unless we do something, then the country and the economy is going to be dying for sure. So we need to do something. And as a result, countries like Germany and Singapore and Korea so they introduced massive amounts of automation in the past 30 years so that they managed to achieve a certain degree of GDP per capita growth. So even in the presence of this sort of massive demographic challenges behind, sort of in front of Japan, there are a sort of few possible sort of ways out, I think. So one is automation and another is education. And yet another is introducing immigrants. And maybe the last option is to simply give up and change our worldview so that we can live happily even in the poor world. So I think sort of we should sort of think more clearly about which specific path this society wants to go. And depending on which path we're going to take, the atmosphere and the strategy of the Japanese economy will be different. So that's my take.
So it's very interesting, right? I mean, if you actually look at, sort of long-term determinants of the potential growth rate of an economy, right? You've obviously got the technology changes, the technology input, right? But more important than just the technology is actually the ability for entrepreneurs to actually translate that technology into new corporate formation. And the single biggest determinant of the long-term growth potential of any economy, right, is the number of entrepreneurs that you've got in society. If the number of entrepreneurs in society increases by 1 percentage point, your potential growth rate goes up by about 0.5 percentage points. And if you don't believe it, a simple example, China has always been the biggest population growth economy in the 1960s and 1970s, yet they had no economic growth. They only had economic growth when Deng Xiaoping, right? When they actually opened up the economy for private entrepreneurship, that's when the growth miracle starts. And that's why the entrepreneurial spirit now hopefully is not being squashed by the Communist Party there. Now, I want to open up the floor for questions. This is a big, big topic, right? And, we've strategically tried to avoid talking about the central banks or the fiscal deficit, but, want to open for questions from the floor, anything that's on your mind, any experience that you can share, and one rule does apply. If you don't ask a question, right, you get out. If you speak for more than 30 seconds, you have to buy a bottle of champagne for anybody in this room. And please, if you want to, ask specifically which of the panelists or whom of the panelists you would like to respond. Please, any questions here on the floor? Dozo, Terazawa-san. And if you could very quickly, and I'll give you that slack, that doesn't count as 30 seconds, who you are and what you're doing.
Tatsuya Terazawa. I used to work for the Japanese government. This morning, Minister Kono stressed that the big remaining question is the excessive debt among the SMEs. These SMEs are much smaller than the Murakami-san's mentioning SMEs. What shall we be doing to deal with this massive excessive debt of the SMEs?
Okay, who would you like? Aya? Massive excessive debt from small and medium-sized companies. What should we be doing with it?
I think, we really need to separate the companies that I was talking about, or those companies that has massive excess debt. And are those the companies you talking about, the listed or the delisted?
Delisted, unlisted. Miko.
Right. So, what my father used to say, the money is like a blood flow. When it's stuck in the one part, your human body doesn't really work. You're unhealthy, And when it actually circulates, you become healthy. So I think that's the issue what Japan has. It is stuck in the one part. And that's why it doesn't circulate and it's becoming unhealthy. So I think those are the one of the issues that the Japan has, and we really need to fix that. And then I think it will actually lead to the economical growth all over in Japan.
how to fix it. So we
That's
know the
maybe-
problem. We know the problem. What to do about it?
That's actually, my part where I really have to push those companies that really have the excess cash. And when it comes to massive debt, I don't want to be very sarcastic, but when it has massive excess debt and when it's not really doing the, gaining the earnings, it's very hard to continue the business. You really, really need to look at what you're doing. So I think the problem is, one part is that where this excess cash, you really need to push it out to go and inflow all over its economics. And at the same time, if there is massive debt where it's not really gaining the earnings, I think it really needs to, it's really very difficult to continue its business. We really need to look at whether is it better to continue or not.
What Terazawa-san is pointing at is a huge problem, and it's not just a Japanese problem. In my home country in Germany, after East and West merged, massive problems with underperforming small and medium-sized companies, and there is no clear-cut answer. You can say debt forgiveness practiced under the condition of streamlining the industry, so you merging with me, but it's complicated because the debt is owned, right, by the bankers, which are private people, right, and it's not owned by the government. But some combination, in my personal opinion, of debt forgiveness, if there is a streamlining of the industry that actually results. And that would actually be a nice task potentially for some of the regional governors, right, to implement schemes that fit their particular region rather than something that is ordered by the Ministry of Finance or by the central government. But that's just my personal opinion. We've got a virtual question.
Yes, we do. So we have one question so far from Michael Jones, and this is directed at Narita Sensei. So Narita Sensei suggested that new policies are needed in light of divisions and instability in so many democracies. In that environment, can central banks really pull back from the current stimulus and deficit funding, especially considering that the Fed began its latest money printing binge in September of 2019 with unemployment at 3.5% and long before the COVID pandemic took hold?
Sensei.
That's a very tricky question, and the realistic answer would be sort of no, at least in the short run. But sort of to take a step back, the main reason that sort of so many countries are doing this kind of massive monetary easing and sort of printing so much cash, it is coming from the fact that traditional economic stimulus package and fiscal policies turned out to be so ineffective at dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic. So many governments tried a variety of forms of sort of more traditional economic policies, but sort of a variety of analysis suggests that they were more or less ineffective at tackling the problem. So the only option for many governments sort of became sort of the only purely monetary policy like what they are doing. So the answer is probably sort of not close to no. Then the only sort of the most important thing we need to think about from this perspective is that because of this sort of massive monetary policy, now the sort of divide between sort of capitalists and workers is becoming sort of more and more serious, right? So because of so much excess liquidity and sort of emerging inflation in the US and many other countries. So workers relying on cash flows are struggling to maintain their living standards compared to capitalists who own asset stocks. Then we need to sort of think about sort of some policy that can deal with this problem and alleviate this sort of increasing gap and inequality between the two economic classes. So we really need to think about some wild, very new types of policy, like potentially maybe the wealth tax and the billionaire tax that the US government is currently considering. And without that, sort of the excess concentration of wealth among the tiny fraction of the population will be getting larger and larger. So that's my sense. The simple answer is that probably the answer, direct answer to your question is no. So we need to complement or supplement, okay, that answer with an additional policy that can deal with the increasing economic inequality and wealth inequality.
Any further questions from the audience, please? And by the way, in Japan, the top 1% own 18% of all the wealth. In America, the top 1% own 47% of all the wealth. That's according to the Credit Suisse Global Wealth Report, who they do these numbers for a living. Saito-san.
Hi. Thank you. We can't talk demographics without discussing pension. I am from Yamagata Prefecture, where agriculture is a main industry. Rice production, 1 billion yen per year. Pension payment to the elders, 4 billion yen per year. So what is the difference between the two? You know, so the investors pay attention to the pension elders spending. So I would like to get a comment from Aya-san as an investor's point of view.
Sorry.
So to raise the performance of pensions, right? If the pension payout is much larger than the basic income, right? From an investor's perspective, what do we do?
I think that's why GPIF holds 10% of its Japanese companies, and then it holds all these markets. I think GPIF has to become like the pensions in Singapore. They need to really seek for its gains by investments. Payout ratio and the amount that the GPIF has is not going to be succeeded in 20 years, 30 years when the elder people are going to increase. What do we need to do? We really need to invest into these assets that will, seek for the gains. I think that's the only answer.
You any comment?
Well, yeah, I mean, when you're talking about big imbalances, and this goes beyond just the pension situation in Japan, but I mean, the one way of defining this imbalance is those who feel that they have capital to risk and those that don't. And if you look at the situation in Japan, the oddity is that there is technically a great deal of money that could potentially be risk capital that has chosen not to be, and that's true in both the corporate sense and obviously in the individual individual sense. And what's so interesting about that is that the imbalance is a sort of psychological one there, which is that if you feel excluded from the use of capital to take risk and therefore to play in that game that seems to be making a lot of people very, very wealthy, then that's the way that things will stay. It gets locked in. And what was fascinating, Aya-san is exactly right. What's fascinating is that the attempt for the GPIF to kind of show the way, I guess you'd say, for Japanese individuals in perhaps in the way that they would think about their own very large savings pools, hasn't really worked as best I can tell. And Jesper, you've got the connection with Monex. I mean, the fees on trading and so on are coming down and coming down. The practical barriers to that risk are lower than they've ever been, and yet it still doesn't make that difference. So it's a very complicated relationship with risk in this country, and obviously it's different in elsewhere. But I think that's the bit that interests me the most.
I think, Saito-san, I think your question in terms of the overall imbalances, because the underfundedness of a pension system is something that every advanced economy is facing, right? Now, as a politician, I would kick this down the can, right? I would kick this down the can. No, I would kick this down. We kick the can down the road. Sorry, I'm German. I don't do these American idioms very well, right? But there is a risk, particularly here in Japan, right? Because I mean, obviously, to fix it, you got to raise returns or you got to cut the benefits, right? And there is a risk that in all this talk about new capitalism, right, that you're actually using this as a hiding point, right, to actually just cut the benefits, right? And as you know, already the benefits here in Japan are starting to be cut. In fact, according to the OECD data, Japan is the only advanced G7 economy where the pension payouts and where the healthcare benefits are actually being cut back. In my country, you win an election, in Germany, you win an election on the basis that, yes, the retirement age is going to be cut from 65 to 63. Good. Unless you do the actuarial calculation. You had a question.
So hi, I'm Sinead. I'm with Toyota's new software company, Woven Planet. Interestingly enough, we're able to attract top software talent out of Silicon Valley to Toyota, not because Toyota has a lot of cash, but because Toyota has the potential to own a lot of data. So I'm not an economist, but I'm wondering, are we heading into a situation where Japanese companies are cash rich, but very data poor compared to their American competitors?
Who should answer? Leo.
No, that's a great example. I mean, there are two things that you've said in there that are crucial. One is how much of the venture element of Japan is currently inside big corporations, and I think that's what NTT, KDDI, Toyota, obviously. I mean, that should not be missed in the debate about where Japan's innovation lies. And thank you for reminding people of that. But sorry, on the data side, yeah, I mean, I know we're a bit tight for time, but historically, Japan's appreciation of the value of I'm not talking about data, before data, appreciation of intellectual property was very much focused on the idea of how many patents you might have, and therefore how many things could be turned into something physical. And it took a very long time, for example, for producers of pure content in Japan to recognize the value they were sitting on. In fact, it had to be demonstrated to them by YouTube, right, who suddenly realized actually thousands of episodes of our cartoons and anime are being downloaded and we're not making a cent from this, right? And so the corporate recognition of intellectual property has now caught up, I think, in Japan. It's not exactly as aggressive as it might be elsewhere, but it's caught up. I think there's a same catching up process with data, but it's going to be a handful of companies rather than whatever 3,000 companies that ISAN looks at.
Great. One question from the virtual world.
Try to make it quick. This is from Sachiko Osaki. And the question is, what do you think the Japanese government should do against corporate excess liquidity and income imbalance concerns?
Fantastic. Aya, very quick answer. What should the Japanese government do against income inequality and excessive cash hoarding?
The beginning of the session, I was talking about Sanae Takaichi's statement about this tax in corporate cash and deposits. And I think it's not actually only about the Japanese corporates. It's also the elderly who holds in the bank account of those cash are sleeping in Japan. And I'm not saying that we all, we really need to datalize all these cash amount, but that's actually one of the way. When you know that the interest rate is around 0.1% or even minus, and when you know that if you still put in the bank account, your money is getting reduced, and if it's taxed, why do you still keep it there? And then when you look at the equities, they have increased almost 5 to 10% every year, and the average of the dividends in the Japanese companies are almost like 3%. So I think I'd rather, not keep in the bank, would rather to invest. And these are the inflows that I'm talking about, like I said, the human body is the same as the economy. So when it comes to the inflows, I feel that there will be the future in Japanese economy.
Excellent. So we've sort of hit the limit of the time here. Sorry that we went a little bit bara, but I think, you got some good specific insights, from practitioners, in academia as well as in investment as well as in the media, on what's going on, where some of the imbalances are. Not quite sure that I know how to summarize that, but I am extremely bullish on the fact that, number one, let's not forget, whether you like Kishida or not, Japan is a bastion of political stability, right? The type of majority that Japan has is the envy of the demographic world, right? So if you want to get something done, you can actually get it done, which is something that Joe Biden finds very hard to do, and my home country, Germany, is going to find very difficult to do, and France is going to find very difficult to do after next year, right? So political stability, and that once there is a consensus on what to do, Japan is always capable of a positive surprise. The second thing is, in my personal opinion, the fact that the ecosystem in Japan has changed so phenomenally. I mean, whether it is Kathy's work on womenomics, 10 years ago, you could not have a serious conversation at the Keidanren about female empowerment. Now you can have a serious conversation. Whether they do something or not is a different question, right? But at least it's out there. Activist investments, right? Where you actually do have pressure on the stakeholder, on the managers, right? On the agents, actually look at your assets. Are they performing well? What can you do to attract greater data talent, right? All of this now is actually starting to happen. And then last but not least, the one thing I learned when I arrived in Japan in 1985, right? My bucho at Mitsui Bussan, right? In one of these meaningful conversations that one has when one is 23, right? And he said, oh, Japan is like bamboo. It's very firm in the ground, it sways, it can do the typhoon, right? But the dangerous thing is when it breaks, it snaps, and this is the generational change. And it is a seniority-based society. Thank God, the older I get, the more I like it, right? They treat you nicely when you're young, which is nice. But the key issue is that what I've mentioned about the corporate change that is happening, right? That is a huge opportunity. And finally, in the money world, right? Do you know that over the next 10 years, the equivalent of about $6 trillion is going to be unstuck from those bank accounts because, of generational transfer. The only problem is that the average age of somebody inheriting money here in Japan is 68, but maybe we can do a little bit of generation skipping in terms of making it more tax advantageous who actually receives the money that is going to be unstuck. Thank you very, very much. The panelists are available for communications. Aya, Murakami-san, fantastic. Narita-sensei, thank you very, very much. And Leo, thank you very, very much. And thank you very much for the audience. Bye-bye.